Comrades, you can see that the material of headlines recently has been the elections in Taiwan and very strong recommendations backed up with armed intrusions into Taiwanese airspace, etc., that from the Chinese bureaucracy, from Xi Jinping, that the Taiwanese voters should be careful and not elect the wrong person. And that wrong person was the leader of the party, which has been in power for 2 terms and would enter the 3rd term. And it would be most unusual, actually, if he continued to rule. The warning was one that would lead on to war. Taiwan was, leadership was accused of warmongering. America mutually then came in and said it would defend Taiwan. In other words, we had a headline of headlines in terms of world confrontations and the possibility of war. Previous discussions, I've mentioned the idea that we are in a period of near wars. In other words, we approach it, it's more than brinkmanship. It's, Immanuel Kant once talked about perpetual peace. Now we seem to be an era of perpetual war or near wars, around the continent. But what are the perspectives that we can see? The elections have delivered the result which Xi Jinping certainly didn't want. It's the last thing he wanted. And yet there seems to be some reflection, some pause on the side of China, but maybe we would be wrong. Nicholas, please come in and lead this discussion. Our normal procedure is to have a discussion, say 25 or so minutes, and then to have debate. And then, of course, you have the right to reply, which I'm sure you'll want to use. Many thanks. Please go ahead.
Okay, again, as I apologized earlier, I will get my food really quick and come back. Okay, comrades, thanks for the invitation. I'm here representing the International Socialist Forward, which is an organization split from ISA in Taiwan. And I'm representing the EC. And so what I will represent here is actually the same content as I represented in the international meeting earlier. I will, however, supply with a little bit of more illustrations to help illustrate the situation. So it's possible to share a screen, right?
Yeah, I think we can do that, Pam.
I think I just got to make Sue co-host. Just a moment, please.
Okay, thanks.
That'll be a moment.
Are we done, Pam?
I'm just trying to find him, Sue, on the list. Hang on.
Yeah.
Can't find him. Roger, can you see him? If we could do it from the picture, just a sec. Hang on. Oh, here, right. So I found it now. Make co-host. Right, coming up now. Right, Sue, you should be able to
I see it.
Yeah, now. Yeah.
So let me share. So as comrades should see, this is I'm just showing some pictures, the illustrations here. So the election result is certainly not what China wants. The result is a result of 3 parties instead of 2. That's the usual case in the history of Taiwan. 3 parties competing for the presidency. And we see that it's a pretty even 3-way tie. So that's for the president. That's for the presidential election. And here is the result for the parliamentary election. So you see like the green and the blue are the two major parties that has been vying for power for the past since the 90s. And then this new party that's called Taiwan People's Party, the teal one, is sort of the newcomer to the bloc. And this is their first time participating in the election. And yet you can see they have one charisma leader who is able to win 24% of the votes for president, and they got a few seats. So that's the result of the Taiwan election that just happened. So certainly not something that's China wants, because this still puts the DPP, the green one, the independent-minded one, parties in power, because they have 32% of votes for presidents, and Taiwan doesn't have the like the two-round system that a lot of other countries have. So this just means it's pretty much means DPP win. And DPP is short of not getting the majority in the parliament. So you see that the KMT has one more vote, for one more seats. So it's an interesting results. We've never seen this in Taiwan. So we have previously emphasized the issue of war anxiety under the imperialist conflict between the US and China. So Pelosi flew to Taiwan, and China had launched a large military exercise around the islands. And that caused a lot of war anxiety and anxiety about the coming impending war. However, since the and this is compounded with the fact that the DPP governments, they under US pressure, they extended the military service, military service that theoretically every Taiwanese male have to participate. They extended from 4 months to 1 year. It was previously shortened from 1 year to 4 months under the previous administration, but now they have changed it back. So that there's a lot of war anxiety here. However, we see that as China's economy is growing weak in recent years, China has kind of softened its tone and tried to soften its tone in the latest APEC meeting, and that has indirectly lowered the risk of war with China. So we see this as a factor into the DPP win, and as the kind of anxiety and the impending war is less pronounced, and that weakened the KMT's main kind of platform of war versus peace. So it's basically the platform of the Blue Party, the KMT, has been that if we elect DPP, they might go ahead and call for independence, which will cause a war. So let's elect us instead for peace. And this has also allowed the third party, the Taiwanese People's Party, to get more supports, as they position themselves as a kind of a new politics outside the two major parties. But we'll discuss them. So we see that we see this in the debate just before the election. The three candidates, they have all talked about this issue. However, we see that there's no real way out under capitalism. On the other hand, has compared to 2020 the election, China has lowered its China has reduced its intervention into Taiwanese politics. We see that in 2020 it was like China did a lot of like rhetorics and a lot of messaging around Taiwan. And however, this time it's much less. So what China has done really so far is just saying that they don't think the results reflects the people's opinion in Taiwan. So it's a pretty weak kind of response to it. And there's no real like military threat. There's no like threat of military intervention, and so on. So it is important to see that. So it's important to see that we don't think a war is directly impending. Is immediately impending. As far as long as like the Chinese economy is still weak, and also there's not even though the DPP won again, there is not a real clear there's not a clear risk of Taiwan calling for independence, because most of the people in Taiwan right now their opinion is to maintain the status quo. Although they will say eventually we want independence, but right now most people will go for status quo. So something contradictory has been that in the past, the people who prefer independence, Taiwanese independence, who you can classify as Taiwan nationalist. However, they usually are also the people who support progressive issues like feminism, environmental protection, and LGBT rights. And on the other hand, the flip side, the people who are against calling for independence are the conservatives who support nuclear power and or like oppose LGBT rights. So in the past, the strategy of our party, of our organization, has been to attract this progressive pro-independence crowds. However, we see that due to the sharpening of the US-China conflict and the like the militarization strategy that the DPP is pursuing and the pro-US militarization strategy, we see that this pro-independence crowd, which has been so far been progressive, has now turned right-wing. It's now like increasingly turned right-wing, which we predict will make it much more difficult to work with them. For DPP, as we said, their main proposal of how to protect Taiwan is to accept US military aid and to militarize Taiwan, and also to demonize all of the voice against the war as defeatist and working for China. So but we see that the end result is that even though they still won, this victory is much more fragile than 2020. They lost about 17% of their votes compared to 2020 election, and they also lost the parliamentary majority. So we think so we predict that in the future, its strategy might still provoke China. However, they will also be countered by the other two parties. It's important to note that it's not true that some people would suggest that DPP is pro-US and KMT and and the the third party are pro-China. It's not really true. They are essentially all pro-US bourgeois parties. It's only the only difference is that is the position is like the more subtle position. So even though KMT and the TPP oppose the outright pro-US strategy, but they might still opt for a more populist or opportunistic line to win political capital, even though they are essentially still pro-US. So the main difference here would be that the DPP has tried to follow the kind of decoupling strategy as with the US, and try to remove or reduce economic independence on China. And on the other hand, for the KMT party, they because China is still the biggest trading partner with Taiwan, so the KMT party is seeking to maintain that trade relationship, and to maintain that kind of economic dependence on China, while relying on the US for military supports, which is the kind of the position that a lot of Asian, like especially Southeast Asian countries, are kind of relying on, kind of working with, kind of following. But however, as the China-US conflict intensifies, we think this kind of take the good thing from both sides kind of strategy will not be as easy. And also we see that as for the US position, US response, we see that from the article from Foreign Affairs that the Foreign Affairs editorial suggests that Lai Ching-te, who won the election, should suspend the kind of independence, suspend the program for independence in their in the program of the DPP party, in order to to maintain the status quo. So US basically came out and say, "Oh, let's not change the status quo," which is against, which is interesting because that's against the will of the DPP party. However, it is essentially like it is kind of the will of the most people currently. Also, the other important thing to note is the rise of the third party. This third party is very young. It was only founded 4 years ago, but they got 26% of the votes, especially a lot of young people. So their position is to stand somewhere, is to stand as a kind of centrist position between the other two parties. They try to maintain like a they try to maintain this middle way between pro-independence and pro-unification. They try to stay in the middle way of China and the US, and the middle way between conservatism and liberalism. So this has of course made some success, allowed them some success, and it has caused, and they have successfully attracted a lot of young people who want new kinds of politics outside the two major parties who has been governing Taiwan for decades. However, this is still, of course, the TPP is still a bourgeois party, and it's not even like a very progressive bourgeois party at that. So we think in the future something we will have to explain because our main focus of our organization is towards young people and students right now. So we predict that in the future we will have to very likely we have to talk to people who have a false hope in TPP, and we will have to explain to them why they are not the right choice for Taiwan, and that's something we will have to work on. So as outside of TPP, outside of this third party, all the other minor parties have failed devastatingly. None of them got a seat, and even most of them actually even like they are even disqualified from receiving government subsidy for the political parties. So we think like so there are two major parties inside of this, two major parties to talk about inside in the other small parties. One is the MPP, New Power Party. The other is Taiwan State Building Party. So this MPP is a more progressive one. Like it's a more progressive. This one they are the more progressive issue party. They support LGBT rights. They support environmental protection. They even criticize the DPP. And however, the main guy, one of the main political elites of them, the main political leader left them for TPP. So that was a devastating blow, and they didn't make it. And the other one is this Taiwan State Building Party, which tied itself very closely to DPP. However, we see that in this election, when DPP is under threat, they just abandoned the state building party, and so meaning that in the election they will just say, okay, let's all vote DPP. DPP will call on its supporters to all vote DPP. So that means, well, nobody is voting for this sidekick. So both of them failed spectacularly. So we think this illustrates two things. One is that, of course, you need independence from the two major parties. Otherwise, you will have the fate of the state building party. They will abandon you when things are tough. On the other hand, even if you have some even if you have some independence from the two major parties and some somewhat reformist progressive ideas, it is still not enough. Like you engaging in electoralism exclusively and to only rely on certain charismatic leaders are not gonna cut it in Taiwan. As for a reformist, like for this kind of progressive politics. So it's obviously different from DPP, who has been somewhat more successful because they are not really positioned in our progressive politics. They are kind of just what they offer is something of like more conservative bent. So we think the difference is here.
Nicholas, if you could start winding up, and then we'll have
this is
discussion.
already we're already over. So in conclusion, we think that the U.S. and China are neither the way out for Taiwan. We support in the self-determination of Taiwan, and but we must build a party that will support the self-determination but also work with the working class in China, and that was something we are trying to build. So that's it. Thanks.
Well, look, I'm sorry if I hastened the conclusion unnecessarily.
No, I was already at the end.
Please know that you will have a chance, and maybe we should open up with some questions. No doubt, comrades, do have some of those, and to indicate who would like to come in. Just before you come in, Ian, are there any other comrades asking questions? Okay, Ian, please come in.
Hi, I was putting my hand up literally as you were saying questions first. So I think that might
Yeah.
be all right, because I've probably got a contribution's worth mainly of questions, if that's okay, because Taiwan is such a fascinating and potentially incendiary part of world politics at the moment. That I was very disappointed, I must admit, to see the war party, as I call the so-called democratic, so-called progressive party, win. I was encouraged to see that it had gone down from 60 odd percent to 40 odd percent since the last election. And I wasn't hugely surprised to see it win once I'd noticed that the two parties that were going to run a joint slate against it, uh, which would have almost certainly succeeded, instead ran against each other and ensured that neither of them would succeed. And it all seemed to fall apart at the last minute. And I suppose my first question was there a US hand in that to ensure that their favoured candidate won? Because it seemed like otherwise they were cutting off their nose to spite their face. The two parties that, whatever our other criticisms of them, are not so mad on confrontation, and in the context of the last couple of years, turning Taiwan potentially into another Ukraine. I know there'll be a lot of moralism around what you were saying. It's defeatist, that we should be inspired by the example of Ukraine, but basically Joe Biden is pushing proxy wars all over the world. You could argue that what's happening in Gaza is a genocide, but also another proxy war of the declining US. Even what's happening between Guyana and Venezuela. I was at a conference yesterday on Latin America, and that came up, and I could see the parallels. But Taiwan's the big one. So I was very encouraged to an extent when you said that the threat of war seems to be declining at the moment, mainly because China is taking a more conciliatory line since the election. But on the other hand, I didn't expect Ukraine to go to a shooting war either. So what are the possible chances? Because it seems that America really wants to push this. If not a war, then a permanent cementing of the status quo of China encircled, which China won't presumably forever accept. It is interesting also, this thing about in Taiwan, it's the kind of cultural, socially liberal left that are more pro-independence and the conservative right that are more pro-unification, because that's the exact opposite of the situation in South Korea, for example. So it's interesting how these things map onto each other. But in terms of the international situation, the social liberals who are not socialists have moved far to the right on imperialism over the last few years. That is very similar to what's happened in America, and with the Trump derangement syndrome, even to an extent with Starmer in Britain. And so maybe that's part of a more international trend. Just your last point, when you were rushing towards the end on Taiwanese self-determination, I'm a little concerned about, would that mean declaring independence? Because I think there's also the question of Chinese self-determination from imperialism, and the way Taiwan came about as initially the government in exile, the KMT, they're pro-reunification because they wanted to retake the whole thing. And now they realize they can't do that. So it seems America's backup plan was the opposition, DPP, who want independence. But the idea that Taiwan is a nation, completely something totally different from China, is, I think, a controversial and ahistorical one, apart from the Aboriginal people of Taiwan whose rights have to be protected and enshrined. But the majority Taiwanese population, whether they came over in 1949 or earlier, I think are Chinese, and some form of reunification should, I think, be the most peaceful solution and could ensure democracy if it was handled right. Though that seems to be getting more and more pushed away by the American intransigent position and the DPP intransigent position, I feel. It's interesting, though, that Hong Kong seemed to really put a rocket under the DPP's flagging campaign in 2020, up to 60%, and now that has fallen flat, and they've got back in through a split opposition. So that's interesting for the future. When William Lai, I don't know why he's called William, but I think it's appropriate because we've got a few Williams in Scotland and Northern Ireland who say, no, 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 never, 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 partition forever. It's almost a stereotype. And that seems to be what he's saying. This has made it irreversible. But is it really irreversible? If it was 60% and it's gone down to 40%, what about next time? Maybe that's why China's taking a relatively chill position, as opposed to seeing this as some kind of casus belli, because it's not that Thailand's going more and more pro-independence. Maybe it's going the other way, but the opposition vote was sadly split this time. So I'll come back to my first question. Was that just stupidity on the part of the KMT and the TPP, or was it something darker, maybe coming out of the embassy or whatever the Americans call it? Because I don't think they're allowed to call it an embassy in Taipei, but the special interest section or whatever. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Ian. Dominic and then Roger.
Yeah, it's John Byrne. Just a question. We've heard about the different political parties, and they all seem to have nuances in the same area, i.e., they do not want unification with China, at least now, and they want some sort of independence in the future. And they all, they all have nuances between them, not sharp contrasts, i.e., one party saying we want reunification with China and another party saying we do not want reunification, we want independence from China. But I'd just like to ask a question on an area that wasn't touched on in the lead-off, and that is, what is the state of the labour movement in Taiwan? What is the position, if any, of the trade unions? And are they, if they exist, because I don't know whether they do or not, have they any political voice? And also, a small point, what was the attitude of, what you can make out of the average Taiwanese towards Nancy Pelosi's visit to China, which seemed to really stir things up a year or two back? So I'd leave it at that. The question of where is the trade union movement and the labour movement, and where is, is there an organised working class? And if so, how does that stand in Taiwan?
Thanks, Dominic. Roger?
Yes, first of all, I'd like to say that it's really good to see the comrade and to know that there's a vibrant Marxist group in Taiwan. I'd like to ask a few questions. Partly they've been touched on already. Obviously, the situation in Taiwan is very peculiar. It's a legacy of the Civil War, and of 7 decades ago. It was the counter-revolution, or the forces of the old regime were chased out of the mainland and took refuge on Taiwan. So one question I've got really is there a serious ethnic divide in Taiwan between the indigenous population and the exiles who came over in flight from the Chinese Revolution? Secondly, I didn't quite gather what is your position on reunification. Would it not be correct to say that we want the reunification of the Chinese nation, and obviously together with the program of political demands for workers' democracy and socialism? Is there in other words, what is your position really on the question of Taiwanese independence? I didn't quite understand that. Sorry if that's a naive question. Also, as John raised the question, I also wanted to what extent is there an independent working class political stance? I'm not clear about whether there's any affiliation of trade unions with either the KMT or the DPP, or whether to what extent there's independent political activity. I know there's trade union activity on quite a big scale, I believe. Also, I'd like to know more about your group. As I say, it's very heartening to know that there is a group of Marxist comrades and young Marxist comrades who are operating on the island. Do you have any, is it possible to have any contacts on the mainland? And, you know, just can you tell me a bit more about that? Is there any possibility of using your position there as a kind of launch pad for the revolution or political revolution in China? Thanks.
Thanks, Roger. Finn, please come in.
Yeah, I want to thank Nicholas for an informative opening contribution. And there's lots of material that we can dwell on and consider following that. So I have a couple of questions arising. The first question is about the Kuomintang. When they took power, or Chiang Kai-shek in 1947, there were 4 decades of martial law. And the leader of the Democratic Party was in prison for 25 years, the same length of time as Nelson Mandela. And the thing that interests me in your opening contribution, Nicholas, was why is the Kuomintang, after all that history of repression, getting more than 30% of the vote with that record? And 4 decades of repression, and they're still a major political force. I don't really understand how that can come about. And another point which I mean, I'm Irish, and the Irish Prime Minister recently said that Taiwan is an inalienable part of China. I'm not sure if you can make statements like that. I'd like to hear a bit more about that. The right to self-determination of the Taiwanese people is the key question. They have to decide what their options are. To say that it was always part of China, you might just as well go back 200 years and use the dynasties, the imperial dynasties, as justification. And if that was used in Ireland, Ireland would have remained part of the British Empire. So this notion of an inalienable link between China and Taiwan, I'd like to hear a little piece more about that. And it's not an issue of ethnicity. The people who now live in Taiwan should have the right to decide their future. Another question I'd like to ask about, you said that your own group, Nicholas, is trying to develop links with the organized workers in China. I'd be interested to hear how that manifests itself. What kind of links? How do you make links with a regime that's so oppressive and so undemocratic as the current Chinese regime? And Taiwan was never, as we all know, was never part of communist China. I'm using the word communist in the sense of the Chinese Communist Party rather than the way Marx would have intended the use of the word communism. But China under the Communist Party, Taiwan was never part of that. It was part of an earlier China, getting back to the point I made there about the imperial dynasties. But since the Chinese Communist Party took power, Taiwan wasn't. And in fact, as Roger has alluded to, it was Chiang Kai-shek and the forces that were opposed to Mao that went to live in Taiwan. So there are many questions, but I'd like to hear a bit of a focus on this thing about the demand. I mean, I think the key issue is the right to self-determination. It's a matter for the Taiwanese people to decide what their future is to be. I think we'd all agree with that. So the question is about emphasis. Why did we raise this question at all? About the need to join with China in a single country. I know there's world politics at play here. The issue of America and US imperialism and threats and war exercises being conducted and so on. I can accept that there's a danger there. But why would we advance, or do we advance this demand about unification when the country that's been posed as worth unifying with is one of the most repressive regimes in the globe? So these are questions. I'm not arguing any particular position. I'm asking questions, and I'd like to hear some discussion about them. But thanks again for your opening contribution, Nicholas.
Thanks, Finn. Nicholas, I hope you've got a set of notes coming, because there's so many questions. But and I want you to be able to come in short, and then sum up. But before we get to that, Kieran, would you like to come in now?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the lead up, Nicholas, which is very informative and very interesting. I have questions too, and they're similar to Roger and Finn and Ian's questions, because it's a very complex situation. And the comrade elsewhere, all of the comrades in this call, were trying to understand the situation. As is often the case, it comes back to the question of consciousness. What is the conscious awareness of workers and young people in Taiwan, which is many millions. It's a large country. My understanding is that the ethnic Taiwanese are a tiny proportion of the population, maybe less than 1%, and aren't an objective factor in the situation. The majority of the ethnic Chinese came in the 1940s, or are the descendants of those who came in the 1940s. But we should note, the 1947 is now 75 years ago. It's 3 generations ago. That's an important factor. So if we can say, broadly speaking, that a large minority, I don't know, is it 20 or 30%, are in favor of reunification, a majority are in favor of independence, a bloc are undecided. My question is similar to the other comrades, well, what that means. So, for example, if I met somebody from Taiwan who said they're in favor of reunification, on what basis? Is that a question of national identity? The points of comrades already made. There's a single Chinese nation, and they see themselves as part of that. Or is there any lingering after effect of the Chinese Revolution, of Maoism, of wishing to be part of a different social system? I suspect there's not. I suspect that's entirely gone, but perhaps not. Perhaps there is a lingering after effect. And for those who are in favor of independence, what does that mean? Because if I met a Taiwanese worker, say I was traveling, I met somebody from Taiwan, and I said, "Where are you from?" And they said, "Taiwan." And if I said, "Well, what sort of a country is that?" What would a Taiwanese worker, a young person, say? Because it seems to me, from a distance, to all intents and purposes, Taiwan is an independent country. It's just a question of terminology and declaring itself as such, but it acts as an independent country in every meaningful way. So does that young person, well, what do they mean by independence, or the person in favor of independence? Does it mean a rejection of Chinese national identity? Is it a question of identity, or a question of the Chinese social system, by which they might mean communism or socialism, or an understanding of the Chinese system? There are no rights in the sense of bourgeois democratic rights, no free elections, no right to protest, no right to organize. And what is their consciousness? And I think it all does come back to this question of national identity. And after 3 generations, 7 decades, is there a Taiwanese national identity? And Finn's question, what do you mean by self-determination? Self-determination of whom? Self-determination of the Chinese nation as a whole? Is that a meaningful question? 1 billion people in very distinct geographical areas. Or is there a Taiwanese national question, a Taiwanese right to self-determination, which the Chinese state would reject, of course? And finally, what is the attitude to the United States of America, given that consciousness in the sense of class has been thrown back over the last number of decades? Would the majority of Taiwanese people look upon America as a friend, in inverted commas, as an ally, in inverted commas? Is that the consciousness of the average worker, the average young person? One which is problematic for us, obviously, but I'd be interested to hear what your answer is. So thank you.
Thanks, Kieran. Nicholas, would you like to come back on some of those points? It's quite a long list, so I'd like you to see if you could come back now. You will still have the opportunity to sum up. And if I could say, I'd like to come in on 1 or 2 points too a little later. Please go ahead, Nicholas.
Okay. Yeah, that's a list of questions. I will try to address the more important ones, especially. So the main question of I think a lot of the comrades raised the question of self-determination. So I think the position of our organization, and I think that's the correct position, is to say Taiwanese people have the right to self-determination. This is based on the fact that yes, Taiwan is already technically a independent country by most of the measure, except by international recognition. And the other thing is that in terms of democratic rights, of course, Taiwan is a bourgeois democratic country, and China currently we see is a capitalist country with very limited democratic rights. So in terms of so most of the Taiwanese people, so when most of the Taiwanese people talk about independence, it essentially means not unifying with China. So the question of unification, independence is actually just like, do you want to unify with China? Sort of. And in undercurrent political system, most of Taiwanese will say no, because China's current political system is has been perceived as a very undemocratic ones, rightly so. And the more radical cases on this are people who say they will never consider unifying with China, even whatever position, whatever political system China has. I think this is a growing position. That used to be a minority, but now is a growing position. So the idea of this idea of self-determination is obviously gonna be less well-founded on national identity, because is Taiwan really a nation? That obviously is a kind of academic question that's not very, that may be up to debates. Obviously, I think here it's important to note that I think in the end, it's whether a group of people is a nation or not we have to look at it dialectically in that a nation can be formed. And obviously in the more pro-independence crowds in Taiwan are actively engaging in the process of trying to form this nation through a bunch of cultural, you can say cultural war, maybe. Like they do a lot of like cultural issues or language issues and try to distinguish Taiwan as an identity from China. Not all of them are very successful, but they're trying. But in the end, the vast majority of Taiwanese, the idea of wanting an independent country is, I would say, and we have argued, have been really more to do with political freedom, of not wanting to live under the Chinese government in order to maintain the current political freedom. So that's also why the DPP got a surge of popularity following the 2019 Hong Kong protests, because people saw how China crushed the Hong Kong protests and basically took away the whatever formal in the democracy they had that Hong Kong used to have. So next, very important question, the labor movement in Taiwan. So the labor movement in Taiwan are, we are unfortunately, I would say unfortunately, our organization is not very well involved with them. This is somewhat due to our ages. Most of our members, actually, almost all of our members are not yet working. So we don't have a lot of comrades who are in that can potentially be in a union. So the Labor Party is not oops. So the labor movement in Taiwan, as far as we know, they most position themselves as the more radical ones. They position themselves as trying to be against the major parties. They're trying to be against the bourgeois order, which I think is correct. They, however, don't, as far as I can tell, they don't always take a very clear stance on the question of a unification independence. They kind of, most of them, when they speak about it, they oppose. I remember they oppose the kind of some of the more extreme, like militarization strategy, or I think they oppose some they oppose it's usually whoever is in power, they will oppose it. So DPP is in power, so of course their messaging has been to oppose the DPP like the DPP fear mongering. However, it's not a very clear position, as I can say. So the labor movement in Taiwan, they are not super politically active, and so I think there should be a working class position, and that working class position should be about on this issue should be about basically our position. Like, we should work with Chinese working class because obviously in principle our interest is aligned with the Chinese working class and not with the bourgeois class in Taiwan, the bourgeoisie in Taiwan. And in the real way out of this dilemma is to work with Chinese working class and hope for and build towards a revolution in China that can solve this, and a revolution in Taiwan. So back to our main position on this issue. So our organization's main issue on this is we already said self-determination. And then the eventual idea is that, of course, we do not call for unification in China. However, we call for a socialist independent Taiwan, and then a socialist federation with China, in the idea that when China has a revolution and becomes a truly socialist country, then we call for a socialist country in Taiwan that will be in the federation with China. So that's the current stance of our organization. And then some of the other questions. So the indigenous people, yes, they account for like 2.5% of the population in Taiwan. That's a very unfortunate historical fact that a lot of them were just well ethnically cleansed by earlier settlers in the 19th century, and that was unfair, or even earlier than that. It's unfortunate. It's very unfortunate. So in terms of political like leanings, it's interesting because the indigenous people are stereotype is that they vote KMT. This is somewhat of a of a enemy is a friend, or it's also somewhat because the KMT has such well-established social organization inside the indigenous community. So this also links to the question of why the KMT is still so powerful. Well, because part of the idea is that the KMT, because the current democracy Taiwan currently has, is both a result of the protests and like the DPP and the precursor of DPP. Basically, they are a bunch of pro-democracy protesters, and their actions is all both of combined with their action, and also the KMT kind of at the very end, the last dictator of the KMT just say, okay, let's have an election, and kind of it's also partially a top-down kind of reform that gave Taiwan's democracy. So in return, the DPP is not totally overthrown. They still retain a place in the new political system. And also the DPP and the KMT also has very entrenched social organization in Taiwan, especially on the local politics, that are still working for them, and can just that kind of a network of beneficiary and political machines that still are very powerful. But of course, our analysis is that after following this election, we think those connections might start to pivot towards working for the newcomer, the TPP as well. It's possible it's possible that will happen. And essentially, at the very end, the DPP and KMT, they are kind of a lot of times they're offering the kind of same thing. They're offering the same thing. It's just that the focus, the emphasis is a little bit different. Like the KMT will emphasize, okay, we also want to trade with China, but the DPP might be go a bit more. The DPP might be more a little bit more one-sided. Say, okay, let's all go for the US, and but on a lot of other issues, they are very similar. So are the average workers, the average people in Taiwan, as I said, the main idea is that they want democratic rights. They want democratic rights. They are neither, well, they are pro-US in the sense that if you say, okay, do you want to be ruled by the China, or do you want to be more allied with the US, they will probably pick US. And that of course has negative effects when it comes to other international issues like Palestine, and other issues in other like issues that will or you like Ukraine. Taiwanese people are usually more, on average, more pro-US, which is a challenge. That's a challenge. But they are not like but I think this is somewhat this is just somewhat to be expected as a US ally country. Just like a lot of other US ally countries. And do we have any other question? Yeah, and then finally, like basically the result of this election has a lot to do with like the KMT and the TPP not working out. Is it really just their stupidity? Well, maybe there's partially that, but also it's very important to see that because a lot of the support base for the new party, the TPP, are young people who are tired or are sick of the old two parties. So if the TPP actually go ally and foreign coalition with the KMT, it's possible you will lose this part of the support base. So that coalition was not a total given, even though in hindsight, it looks like if they are able to if they are in a coalition, they will probably win because they account for like 60% of the votes outside the DPP. But it's not, I don't think it's like a 100% guarantee that their support base are compatible. So I think it's partially that they are not in a coalition. So but well, it will be in either way. It will be a very interesting period in Taiwanese politics as we now have a third party that will challenge the other two. It will mean a lot of unrest and like instability in Taiwan in terms of politics. So I think that answered most of the questions. Let me know if I missed something. Thanks.
Yeah, many thanks, Nicholas. Jan, I see your hand did indicate. Your hands indicated, even if the indicator didn't work. So you're on the list. Steve, and then Jan, and then I'd like to make some contribution. Steve, please come in. Steve, you unmute, please.
Okay, I think that the working class in Taiwan is concerned about what would happen if China took control of Taiwan, and I think we have to look at what happened in Hong Kong, because they did crush unions, social democratic unions. They crushed any kind of workers' movement in Hong Kong, and the capitalist class are in charge in Hong Kong. And I think it'd be good to what would happen to Taiwan if they did take it over. Basically, it would be a capitalist state, and I think that the one of the things that there was a trade agreement that the working class was opposed to in Taiwan. I happened to be there when there was a protest outside the government and the parliament, and there were demonstrations of native Taiwanese, the students, progressives, and nationalists, and so I think that one of the reasons that workers were opposed to this trade agreement was that there's some background sound.
Yeah, comrades, please mute if you're not speaking.
Okay,
Go
so
ahead, Steve.
one of the things that I interviewed workers at that rally. I sent some links to Pat of my interviews of the protesters, and I actually spoke at the rally supporting the Taiwanese working class. Is that they were concerned that Chinese, first of all, the Chinese capitalists wanted this trade deal because they wanted to expand in China. That was what the Chinese bureaucracy was arguing, supporting them. They said, if you sign this trade agreement, you can export capital easier, banks and others, to China. So a capture of Taiwan by the Stalinists, the Chinese bureaucracy, would mean the crushing of any independent workers' organizations in Taiwan, which and that's one of the reasons workers are against unifying with China. They're against the bureaucracy. They're against attack on their rights. Now, Taiwan, interestingly enough, has a better health system, national health system, than China, where it's been privatized. So it seems to me that the fight to defend the Taiwanese working class and to spread that fight into China against the bureaucracy, against capitalist control and capitalist exploitation in China. Not that it doesn't exist as well in Taiwan. And I don't think there's a working class party, obviously, in Taiwan, but I think the task of a working class party in Taiwan would be to defend the working class in Taiwan, to oppose militarism and U.S. imperialism, and to say that the Chinese bureaucracy has to be overthrown. That bureaucracy is not representing the interests of the working class. And I think you can show that by, again, what happened in Hong Kong, what would happen in Taiwan if the Chinese bureaucracy took it over. So those are some.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. Jan, please come in. Unmute, please.
Thank you very much, Nicholas, for your interesting lead-off. Well, you said that the Chinese economy is weak. I believe that we shouldn't depend so much about that estimation. China, the growth in the Chinese gross national product since the beginning of the 21st century has been extremely fast, and even if the Chinese economy is not growing as fast as it used to do, like in 2010, the growth in the Chinese economy is still impressive if you compare it to the economies, let's say, the European countries. So I don't think we should draw any major conclusions about the weakness of the Chinese economy. When it comes to the raising tensions between the United States and China, China have started a program of developing their own nuclear missile program. And they are, in the long term, aiming for a sort of parity with the USA. In short term, they might go for let's say, or at least that's what US estimates is. They go for a quarter of the number of nuclear missiles that the United States possess. So that's on the Chinese side. Joe Biden, he said that the US responsibility when it comes to Taiwan is just as great as the US responsibility is towards any NATO member. And I believe this shows that the threat of war over Taiwan is not to be taken lightly. The threat of war when it comes to Taiwan is something to be that must be taken very seriously. Maybe not in the next year or two, but nevertheless, if China becomes a major nuclear power, nuclear missile power, that will affect China's possibilities to try to intervene military on Taiwan, because that would put the United States in a position of, are we really, well, Taiwan is important to us, but is it really so important that we would like to risk a nuclear war with China over Taiwan? Because that question will be put when China is becomes a great nuclear power. And I wanted to stress this question because I think it's very important. And I also wanted to give a sort of response to Nicholas, what you were saying about the weakness of the Chinese economy. because I don't think it is that weak. Then I just want to end by saying that if it's possible, if you could develop a bit more about the national identity in Taiwan, because I think the question about I think you said that this was something, I might have misunderstood you, but I think you said that this was something of an academic question. I really don't know what you mean with that. I think that the question about if the Taiwanese people have developed a national identity, this is a very crucial question. This is sort of the basis for the case for self-determination. If it's possible, if you could come back to the question about national identity, do you think that the Taiwanese people have developed a national identity? Like we say, perhaps both the Jewish people in Israel, they have developed a national identity. Also, the Arabs in Palestine have developed a national identity. The question is just as important in Taiwan. Thank you.
Thanks, Jan. I'd like to make some points, and Roger, please take out your watch and have a look at how long I'm speaking. I hope to be, less than 5 minutes. Speaking from the chair. I think this is a rich discussion, and some very fundamental questions are being posed. And thanks, Nicholas, for your lead-off and for some of the responses. A recent study I saw mentioned that of all the conflicts which are posed in front of us and which we are living through, the conflict between China and America is right at the top of the list. And many on the left just say, well, therefore, a war between America and China is inevitable. And many on the left repeat a point which has been made by journalists and say, well, there it is. But actually what the discussion shows is that war in itself is not inevitable. Conflict through capitalist exchange and through capitalist investment enormously raises the tension, but there are certain constraints. For instance, the Cold War hasn't actually ended up with a war between America and Russia in the past. And so you can have a very long period, which I've talked about as a period of near war, which is certainly not peace, but it's not actually the outburst of an absolute catastrophe for the whole of humankind. It's somewhere just short of that. And so what we see, I think, in China, and particularly now in Taiwan, is that what most people on the left have thought to be a simple puppet regime of the US actually has some active part, an active component in it, which we're now talking about in terms of indigenous people who were utterly suppressed and almost exterminated, I think, with over a period of time, and certain independence over decades has crystallized in a certain level of national consciousness, national, or at least country consciousness, which is independent from a massive force. Just compare this to America, where there are hordes of people, maybe hundreds of thousands or millions, desperate to get into America, right? They want to enter it, and yet China doesn't attract, is not a magnet attracting all the people of the area. And there are certain complexities here which we need to look at. For most people, it would seem, in terms of realpolitik, that a tiny nation like Taiwan would be desperate to join like an Eastern European country would want to join the EU. And yet there's vigorous resistance to the idea. And it's not just because it's a puppet regime of the United States, although it has that side of it as well too. I think something we need to discuss and draw out is, although we talk about bourgeois democracy, there's something in the word democracy is still a very alive factor. I've noticed in a recent geopolitical discussion, not in our own ranks, but elsewhere, the word democracy doesn't appear at all. Geopolitics is realpolitik. In other words, the brutal assertion of national and regional power against the lesser powers. But there is the whole colonial revolution was a national revolution, but also a democratic revolution. The struggle in Britain and in America is also a democratic revolution. Now, it's true that America boasts and boasts and boasts again that look what we've got. We've got Taiwan, and there's an election taking place, and we don't even know who's going to win. And it's true they don't know. China has intervened desperately to make sure that the DPP did not win, but it actually did win the presidency despite it losing elsewhere. I'm not saying that's right or wrong, but I'm saying obviously, and we take it almost as read, but it's not taken as read, or it should not be taken as read, that the working class, the youth, and most of the people, I imagine all of the people, are now in favor of a democratic outlook and elections and free and democratic rights for gays, lesbians, and by the way, rights for women, which certainly do not exist in China, at least in the sense that women can simply disappear if they charge rape and things. So in other words, the reunification seems to be a surrender of all democratic rights, because there'd be no way, as in Hong Kong, it was a desperate illustration, or a very nasty demonstration, that anyone who was in opposition or having any leading part is now facing a life sentence already in prison. I mean, there's no doubt that the Chinese bureaucracy would do that, and there's no doubt that the people actually understand that would happen, and that is part of the resistance to reunification, because it means giving up the democratic rights, which have not been given by the United States. It never gave any democratic rights to South Korea or to Taiwan. I think the CIA probably ran those regimes completely, from in the 1950s and 60s. In South Korea, it took a national uprising to be able to kick out the CIA-appointed regime. And I imagine in Taiwan, there was something like that too. In other words, the working class has struggled for those rights and doesn't want to just throw them out the window and replace a kind of KGB with the CIA and start the struggle all over again. Just one point I'd like to stress is that there's the most horrendous exploitation by Taiwanese companies in China. Foxconn has the most disgusting record of exploitation of Chinese working people, which the Chinese Communist Party supports entirely. Foxconn produces these iPhones, which many of us use, and we don't know that's virtually produced by forced labor in China. Now, in other words, the right of workers to resist the exploitation, which the Chinese bureaucracy invites different corporate bodies to come and exploit the Chinese working class, that continues. Apparently, Foxconn, when it had a rash of suicides through despair of the working class at changing the conditions, instead of changing those conditions, it put out nets to catch workers as they jumped out of the windows of end in a net. And that was their answer to the question of the despair of the working class, who were forced to work shift after shift under the most desperate conditions in Foxconn. And just also let us remember, I think it's something like 112 million workers in China have no rights at all. They are those who are called the migrant workers. They have no rights to enter the city and to be able to put their children in schools. I mean, we must be very clear. China is a state, let's call it, has elements of a planned economy, Some people call that socialist, but it is absolutely based on the extreme exploitation of the working class. That's easing over time, yes. Certain layers are being eased, but there is no rights yet remaining for that migrant labor, and it's a very big issue because in South Africa we have lived on the exploitation of the Chinese of the cheap labor system, something similar. And I've even heard people in the Communist Party in South Africa defending that and saying, yes, that's we cannot have the urban areas invaded by these rural people and taking over in this way. So it's China's working class is deeply divided, not in its consciousness. Obviously, there's consciousness of exploitation, but in the working of the Chinese Communist Party to make sure that the working class in China is exploited. And by the way, where they have fewer constraints, as in Namibia, I've listed about 21 practices which are all forms of forced labor, breaking every single ILO convention. And the Chinese do that in Namibia because they can get away with it, because they put SWAPO, that is the national leadership and government, they put them onto the boards of directors. So everything they do by exploiting, by kicking workers out, by bringing police and threatening workers with guns and so forth, this is how exploitation is being carried out. And I imagine that's what happens in Foxconn, which is a Taiwanese company, but exploiting Chinese workers. And so we have, I think we mustn't work with such, what shall I say, concept which need to be corrected by elementary facts when we examine the working class. I would encourage the comrades in Taiwan to work with us as we work in Namibia and South Africa and elsewhere, because the myth is, China has just come through an examination 2 days ago by the United Nations Human Rights Commission. And at the end of that interrogation, it was a very mild interrogation. The BBC said everybody was extremely polite. But at the end of the day, I think some of the 30 delegates danced in celebration that they'd got through the hoop of human rights. We need to look at this question of human rights. There are no worker rights in China. And when workers come out and on strike, I won't go into all the records there, we need to examine that. But when China's companies expand internationally, there's the most terrible degradation of human rights in Namibia and throughout Africa, in Latin America and elsewhere. We have to have our eyes wide open. And just because US imperialism does this, we mustn't assume that Chinese imperialism will not do exactly the same. Thank you. Other comrades to come in? I think I've got Nikos to appear.
Yes, comrade, thanks. Just 2 points in this to contribute to this discussion. One is about this issue of national identity that came up in Taiwan. I think Nicholas can say for himself, but I think what Nicholas was mentioning, that this is an academic issue, is if the Taiwanese people have the right, quote unquote, to have a national identity, since they speak the Chinese language, from what I understand, and they descend from, China. But, in general, we should say that all national identities are based on the feeling of the people. So I think that we should recognize that if Taiwanese people feel as an independent state, they should have the right to self-determination. And this, we can discuss for hours on how this came about and what this is based. But the fact of the matter, from what I understand, is that people in Taiwan want to be independent from China. And I think we should acknowledge that right as Marxists, and we should fight for this right of self-determination. So that is one general point. The other point is that I think that while the US is trying to position itself, and there's a general propaganda in the West that China is kind of more or less about to invade Taiwan, and we should like try to prevent that and put all the West forces to protect democracy in Taiwan. The picture is not quite that. I mean, China definitely wants to incorporate Taiwan. The Chinese Communist Party has set this, general target, but at the same time, I think it's kind of clear that China is not in a hurry to do that. In general, China, because it sees itself as the rising power, has, so to speak, time on its side. So in a way, it's not, it understands that as the situation evolves and as it is getting bigger, they will have a better chance to do that without getting in a war. So the picture that's trying to be painted by the US that the attack of the Chinese regime in China is imminent is not it's not correct. The second thing is that the Taiwanese people are not very keen on like jumping in the on the like strategic idea that the US military complex has, because and I think Ukraine and that's a question also for Nicholas. I think that Ukraine must have played a role in that, and that I think that goes for the whole world. So I think that nations or states that are kind of like linked to the US, and the US was kind of like offering them protection, so to speak. I think they saw that the US cannot actually protect them in a way they imagined some years ago, and that will play a role in consciousness. It's also clear that the US has an idea to actually kind of like sacrifice Taiwan if needed in the war against China, and I think that Taiwanese people sense that. I think there was a statement by a US official saying that if China invaded Taiwan, they would bomb the TSMC. That is the main like microchip production manufacturer worldwide. And I think that created a situation. There are other statements by US officials that Taiwanese people also see behind what is played there. They understand that the US is not like acting in their interest, and they would be like, as the Ukrainian people are kind of sacrificed in this world of domination, that they will be the next one. So they're not keen on doing that. So while at the same time, I think it's clear that the Taiwanese people do not want to be incorporated from China, I think it's also clear that they kind of like trying to keep a distance from the US chariot, so to speak. So I think this also was reflected in the election results, as Nicholas correctly analyzed. And I think we should bear that in mind, because the battle between China and the US for world domination actually underscores all our developments in our era, especially the Taiwan Strait situation. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you, Nicholas. Do we have any indicators? I'm pleased to see some comrades have joined now who I hadn't seen before. So you're very welcome to the discussion. Please feel that you could come in. And Kosikana Gumedi, you're welcome. Good to see you. Any other comrades to come in? Well, just one last, if I could, from the chair, just to raise a question rather than to make a further contribution, Nicholas, just consider this. It seems that it is not possible to have what you could say a proxy war, or what, let's call it, a small war. That any war which happens around Taiwan would inevitably be a catastrophic, abysmal destruction of Taiwan and China, and also of America, because it would be unbalancing whatever there was, which is very delicately balanced at the moment. I wonder if you just consider that question. Just and tied to that, I've heard many reports recently from in different ways interviewing Chinese youth, and there seems to be quite indifferent. I'm surprised. But in other words, some of the issues that we posed just didn't bother them. You know, about war with China or invasion or something like that. Now, maybe this is wrong. Instead of that, they were saying it's very difficult to get housing in Taiwan, and it's almost impossible to get a house, and that the wages are very low compared to the cost of a house, and all the social issues are not yet crystallized yet in the politics of Taiwan. And actually, like South Korea, where people yawn when there's another missile sent out because it's just another missile. Every day there's a missile. People are indifferent now to threats of war and so forth because it just happens so often. It doesn't seem to make any difference. Now, I know those seem ludicrous for us from a distance. It seems as though you know, we're on the tip of a war, but it's strange that we can have such dislocation psychologically from what everyone imagines would be the case. Look, I'm just throwing even more questions to you, and I apologize for that. But any other comrades to come in? Otherwise, I think we could start drawing to a conclusion. I think, Nicholas, would you like to come in and draw together some of the bigger points as well as any answers you wish to make to specific points? Thank you.
Okay, thanks, comrades. And I think especially Nicholas and David gave touch on very great point. I just didn't touch on. Like, for example, as Nicholas correctly said, the reason we think China is not the reason we think war is not imminent is yes, ultimately it's about because China perceives time as being on their side, because the overall trend of the world of the geopolitics in East Asia is that China is growing relatively stronger as the US is able to intervene there. And so China's idea is that we will grow so strong that the US will not be able to intervene effectively. And also militarily, China is, I think for China, the best scenario is for Taiwan to just surrender without like a full out confrontation, a full out invasion. And that will be the best scenario for China. So I think China is still not totally like given up on that scenario. On the other hand, so the idea of national identity in Taiwan, this needs an explanation. So the idea of what I was trying to get at when I say like Taiwan, that self-determination is a sort of an academic and dialectical issue, is that it can change. This is something a group of people, like the population of Taiwan, their idea of whether there's a self-determination, well, no, not there. The idea of whether there's a national identity of Taiwan is something that has changed over history, and can still change in the future. So currently, when we look at the poll, the poll says right now is that I'm looking at this graph. It says currently 30% of 60% of Taiwanese people think they are Taiwanese. And then another 30% think they are both Taiwanese and Chinese. So this is a very clear picture that in terms of self-determination, there's currently the majority thinks they are Taiwanese, and then about 1/3 will say, okay, I'm Taiwanese, but also Chinese. So it's a trend towards more and more people thinking they are Taiwanese. but this is obviously different from the election results, and also different from people who say, what do you want? Do you want the status quo or unification? Because currently, the majority of people will say we want status quo. We don't, and because what that means is that there's because calling for independence might result in a war. There's still a fear of that resulting in a war, and as Nicholas said, Taiwanese people are none of the Taiwanese people really wants to become the second Ukraine. So Taiwan is just as China wants to sort of avoid having a war right now. Taiwanese people also don't want to have a war right now, and so status quo is kind of the compromise that everybody's Taiwanese people are able to the wants, and that certainly reflects on the election. That's because the DPP government in the past 8 years has kind of aligned themselves more with the U.S. and the U.S. pressure Taiwan into militarization is kind of a break from that status quo. So that could be I think that's reflected why they are punished. On the question of Chinese economy, I admit that's sort of, we think China's economy is relatively weak in recent years, but that's the overall trend is probably the overall trend is that they will grow stronger and eventually probably overtake US. So we can still not totally rule out a war in Taiwan. It's just that we think it's not imminent. It's not happening in very soon. Like there was talk about 2025 war. We don't think that's happening. Yeah, and indeed, like because of that, because most of us don't perceive the war as imminent, most of the Taiwanese people are instead more focused on, like they especially young people are more, they care more about the economic issue, social issues, local domestic issues like wages and housing, and that's usually how we talk to them. Like that's how usually we as a socialist organization resonate with the young people. Like very easily we can talk to them about wages, we can talk about housing shortages, high rents, and that's usually how that's been pretty successful. On the question of like honestly, I'm not a military expert, so I'm not super sure whether a war will actually be devastating, will be apocalyptic. It will certainly be very bad for Taiwanese people. And on the question of whether the U.S. will actually intervene, I think in the end that's something that will be tied to a different aspect, which is currently Taiwan's value to the U.S. is one is its location, like it's a pro-U.S. country that's very close, that's just right next to China, so it's very strategic important. The other is that the chip manufacturing capability in Taiwan is also very important to the U.S. Is essential to the world economy. So it would be deduced that U.S. will probably have incentive to protect Taiwan. But if the chip manufacturing, for example, right now, the U.S. is pushing for chip manufacturing to relocate to the U.S., not super successful, and it doesn't look like it's on a very fast progress, but they are trying to go in that direction. And if that happens, that might reduce the importance of Taiwan, and then eventually it might go to a place where the U.S. will say, actually, we give up on Taiwan. Like if just like then not be directly involved. And so I think this is overall, I think in conclusion, this is there's a lot of aspects, and we have to talk about it. And even and very importantly, I think David touched on the fact that the role of Taiwan capital in China, and that's indeed very important. It's very important to see that we should convince the working class in Taiwan and China that the capitalists are not the people, and so the capitalists are not some people are not the people we should trust. Like, we should instead working class with working class and try to bring about a better future instead of the Taiwanese capitalist or the Chinese Communist Party, which exerts a lot of imperialist, we think imperialist influences. And that's the only way out of this situation. And we will try our best, all our best to prevent a war which will be catastrophic to the working class on either side of the straits, and to bring about a socialist kind of future where we can live peacefully and outside of and away from imperialist influences. So that's it. Thanks.
Well, thanks very much. Very good. It's marvelous to have a contribution of this quality directly from, let's not use the word frontline, because we don't want it to become a frontline of war, but a frontline of class struggle. And so thank you very much, Nicholas, for coming in. Roger, would you like to make an announcement in relation to a future discussion? And I want to close with a point as well, please.
Yes, of course, the eyes of the world are focused on Gaza at the moment and the role of Israel in the genocidal campaign that is taking place there. And that has focused, again, attention on the nature of the Israeli state, the history of the Jewish people, and particularly the role of Zionism. We're very lucky that we've got a speaker who is a real authority on the history of Zionism and of the Jewish labor movement. He is David Rosenberg, who is the founder of an organization in Britain called Jewish Socialist Group. He'll be speaking on the history of Zionism and also of the other trends in working class Jewish history, such as the Bund. So I hope everybody will come. It's obviously a very live topic. So see comrades there, I hope.
Yes, thank you, Roger. Comrades, if I could conclude with a point. We've had an appeal from Swakopmund in Namibia to defend comrades who are fighting for their job in a hearing in which they're to be disciplined for giving evidence at the labor tribunal, which happened in Windhoek. And these comrades are facing a pro-capitalist labor commissioner who is not giving the rights of workers in the time of day. And if we could get some action to give support, these are the comrades who may be otherwise fired in the next, or their firing confirmed in the next 2 weeks. And it's a matter of some urgency. If comrades could indicate, we would like to circulate a petition, and more direction to appeal against the preliminary decisions which have been made in their case, and for them to be able to continue as workers. And just remember that this is also tied up with a Chinese employer in Namibia. And the rules and regulations which they are applying do not include workers' rights. And we feel that the rights which Namibian workers have fought for over decades, not those that have been given to them by imperialism or anyone else, because they never have been. They fought for themselves, need to be recognized. if comrades would please respond, we'd like to put out something to give support in that direction. Okay, comrades, thank you again, Nicholas, and other comrades. Oh, sorry, Nigel, do you want to come in? Or
yeah, could we have that
last
as an
one-
could we have that as an email to take up
Yes,
in our trade unions and trade councils, please?
That's fantastic. Yeah, thanks, and all comrades, let's see what what we can do if we can reverse some of these adverse decisions. Okay, thanks, comrades. It's marvelous to have this contribution yet again, and thank you particularly, Nicholas. That was marvelous. Bye for now.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Mm-hmm.